What we wanted to do was focus a little bit more on the potential for and the obstacles to using big data, both privately gathered, and you'll see from Erica, government-gathered data. And we also wanted to hear some from the point of view of people who are in companies that are producing these data. What are the ways in which they can and can't share the data with the public and so forth? So at the very end, we have Michael Brown, who's the principal U.S. economist at Visa. Next to him is Fiona Gregg, who's a managing director and director of consumer research at the JPMorgan Chase Institute, which is doing a lot of work with the data that JPMorgan Chase have. Erica Groshin is currently a visiting senior scholar at the Industrial Relations School at the Cornell University, but relevantly, she was the Commissioner of Labor Statistics from 2013 to beginning of 2017. And Crystal Connie is the chief of the branch of consumer prices at the BLS. She and some of her colleagues, Brendan Williams and David Friedman, have a paper at the CRIW, which is on the website, which is interesting because it talks a little bit about how they are using what they call alternative sources of data. I think that when Louise and I have been thinking about this project and what can we add to the conversation, there are at least three things that we are trying to accomplish. One is we just want to highlight what's actually happening, because I think in some quarters there's a great deal of skepticism, particularly in the part of the business community, that the statistical agencies are behind the curve, and if only they understood how to use big data better and better methods, they could do the whole thing and we could save a lot of money and get better measurements, and we'd all learn that the economy's better than we think it is anyways. Secondly, I think there are really interesting issues within the government, and Erica's going to talk to them. And thirdly, there are constraints. There are opportunities, but there are also constraints on the private sector. JPMorgan Chase has the luxury of having God knows how many regulatory agencies looking over their shoulders, and the Bank Secrecy Act and the anti-money laundering, and then we'll talk when Brian comes up a little bit about the privacy issues, which are both technical, and I think we can talk some about them here, but they're also political. How much do the American people want that the government to know every time they swipe their credit card, and do they believe that it's anonymized, and is it just anonymized to the Fed, but Palantir knows exactly what I'm buying and they're telling the Chinese or something? So I think I think they're real issues, and people think that, and it's a real issue in the census. People don't believe that the census will be kept confidential, then they're not going to tell the census takers that they're not legal immigrants or they're working off the books. So these are not theoretical questions. Let's see. Why don't we start with you, Michael? You've explained to me a little bit about what Visa does with its data, which has some similarities to the data that First Data has. What you do with it, what you share, why you can't share more, and what you think the pros and cons are of using it as a proxy for what's going on in the economy.
Sure. So just some high-level stats to give you some insight into what we actually are able to see in terms of visibility. Basically, 20 cents of every dollar Visa captures through its ecosystem on its rails. Last year, that amounted to about $3.7 trillion. That's capturing both consumer as well as consumer, and that's roughly just under 69 billion individual transactions that we're able to see. So the data richness is quite impressive, to say the least. But as Claudia pointed out, in her academic paper very thoroughly covers it, the cleaning of this data and the turnaround is quite immense. Just for our team in Business and Economic Insights, we have essentially a team of 3 individuals besides an entire data science apparatus within Visa that are required to clean and comb through this data. And so, what are the challenges? Well, as Claudia pointed out, certainly mapping it to economic data is extremely challenging. And we have to go talk to finance groups and our mergers and acquisitions groups and our sales teams to figure out, have we onboarded a major new merchant within our ecosystem that then boosts our payment volume. So there's all of these factors that are secondary to the pure economic effects that we're trying to tease out. They're extremely time-consuming, and it's a very laborious process to get that data to a point where we can actually utilize it for economic analysis. The types of things that we do currently, we have a product that is known as our visit database, and this is probably our most high-profile product out of our group at least, which essentially allows not only countries but states and local communities here in the United States to look at global international travel into and out of their metro area. And so you can imagine this is very valuable when you're trying to determine things like where should I market for tourism spending. So it allows a lot of these countries around the world to not only be sort of more strategic about the way they plan, but it also helps local communities in terms of their development and marketing efforts on that regards. In terms of global data trends, we just completed a study looking at the globalization of cities, and more specifically the growing middle class globally and what that could mean as demographics sort of catch up with consumer spend. So that's another product. And then one pilot project that we have, currently just a very small number of participants, but we do have what we call the Retail Spending Monitor. It's a monthly report that takes VisaNet data and extrapolates that to account for all forms of payment, so cash as well as things not captured in our client base. This is similar to the analysis done by First Data with the First Data information. And essentially, it's giving us a decent real-time pulse of what's going on, but there are months that it, again, is the noise to the signal ratio is far too high for it to be useful as economic analysis. So, you know, I would echo earlier comments that it is another tool in the toolbox. I don't think it replaces our official government analysis.
And when this retail monitor, is this something you provide to the public or only to Visa customers, or how does that work?
Actually, it's not even to all Visa customers. It's in a pilot stage at this point because we're just simply testing the waters and soliciting feedback on this product. So, you know, right now I would say that you know, that's one of the things that we're trying to develop, but it's been a very slow process.
And the other things you mentioned, are they things that you just provide as a public service, or do you sell to customers, or what?
So it varies. Most of them are either some form of payment, you know, to cover the cost of producing the analysis and the high-level aggregate statistics. And then Visa also has a program known as VIK, or Value in Kind services, that will provide if there are existing partners with merchants or other entities.
I mean, to give the merchant who's a customer of using your cards information from your thing. And if 6 smart economists from MIT came to you and said, we'd like to find a way to use your data to do something, would your management say, wow, this is a great idea, we can improve the usefulness of our data? Or would the lawyers say, you got to be kidding?
So without singling out either one of those two groups, I would like to stay at Visa. You know. So, you know, I think the key message here is, and you'll get into this later, there are two broad umbrellas of concerns that our executive team and us as data users within Visa have. First and foremost is certainly privacy concerns. Privacy concerns amongst not only our consumers and protecting that data, as well as our merchants. And, you know, the Visa has been built on trust, and it's very important and the top priority of the firm to maintain that trust and the integrity of the data. So hence the reason why you don't see as widespread sharing of that information. And the second is actually more to do with financial securities law. As a publicly traded entity whose revenue stream is dependent upon this sort of real-time measure of the consumer, you can imagine it becomes a major concern about front-running a quarterly earnings report in particular. So the question is, how do we, in a responsible manner, provide that information, but yet not violate the securities laws and the apparatus around, you know, insider information and the public reporting of that?
Thank you. Fiona, let me just ask, how many people here know anything about the JPMorgan Chase Institute? Okay, so it's about half. So maybe you could just start by explaining what it is, and then we can get into some of the specifics.
Great. So the JPMorgan Chase Institute is a think tank inside JPMorgan Chase, and we use the firm's administrative data to do economic research for the public good. So everything we do, we put on a public website in aggregate, so not the microdata, but the results, the reports, et cetera. our remit in terms of the data that we're accessing has mostly covered the consumer and community bank, which includes relationships with roughly half the households across all of our consumer products. So you can think about 70 million households roughly where we might have a checking account relationship or a credit card relationship. You can think about, that would include roughly 30 million mortgages, and then auto loans, et cetera. We just accessed a historical student loan portfolio that has been now sold, but we still have the data. And then, also 2.5 million small business accounts. So we can also start to look at small business checking account and credit cards. And then in the investment bank side of the world, we have also started to access trading data, roughly 400 million transactions across 44,000 institutional investors. So we're starting to map those data assets to obviously economic concepts, income and spending of households, revenues and expenditures of businesses, and I think, as I said, everything we do is intended to answer economic questions. A couple of use cases. We also did some work on the impacts of income and spending in the context of Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. But I think what's maybe a little bit distinct from these data assets from, say, what we heard from Claudia or Michael, is that it's not just the spending picture. With the checking account data, you also see inflows. And so you can study income. And so an example of what we've done with that is the work that we've done on the online platform economy, where with the virtue of a big sample, we can narrow down to 2 million people for whom we observe income coming off of 128 different platforms, like ride sharing, home sharing, et cetera. And so we can kind of quantify how big is that market. We, back in 2015 when fuel prices dropped, we looked at the MPC out of lower gas prices. We just released some work on the impacts of tax refunds and tax payments on people's, their spending, their debt payments, et cetera. So it is the large sample sizes that gives you the geographic granularity and the high frequency lens. But I think one more thing that we've been leveraging to a greater extent is just this ability to look at many financial outcomes for a single household or a business over time. I could go into the constraints, though, that are many.
Let me just mention one thing you didn't mention, which I was impressed by. Sometimes seeing income means seeing receipt of government benefits.
Yes.
So there's a nice paper by Pete Kanong about looking what happens when people get unemployment compensation benefits and when they're about to run out and what happens to their spending. But talk about the constraints.
Yeah, I mean, the constraints are I think Claudia, did a wonderful job of highlighting some of them. I mean, these data come with no code book. They fall out of the business operations, right? and you have no idea what changes happen under the hood while you weren't looking, right? So literally this morning, we discovered that a miscellaneous income category went from including ATM cash deposits to no longer including ATM cash deposits, but instead including ATM check deposits. So, and and that was, I don't know why somebody made that change, but here it is. So there's that it makes it hard to know exactly how to interpret, and importantly, when you see a big spike, and there's always this, volatility in the data, some of which is real, some of which is just pure. When you're looking at daily data, people spend 30% more on Fridays and Saturdays, than they do on Mondays and Tuesdays. So how do you kind of sweep all the calendar effects out first, but then also the noise that also exists within these data? And the sampling aspects of this are tricky. I mean, Chase in 2016 released the wildly successful, they ran out of the metal that made the cards, the Chase Sapphire Reserve, right, which was targeted at high income or high potential income millennials. They did an amazing job. Well, sure enough, we have way too, we have this soaring number of high income millennials. Spending is increasing dramatically, so what of that is real versus just the portfolio changes? So we've done a lot of work to, reweight our population and try and adjust for the Chase lens on the world, but how to do that over time when those changes could be happening faster than is then you can reweight is tricky. And then even just having the comparable metrics with which to weight. So we do know something about the demographics. We know how old people are. That's pretty straightforward. But income, right? We don't know what, typically the census tells us, AGI, annual gross income of that sort. We observe take-home income that falls into the checking account. Those are very different numbers. And so we've had to do, spend 2 years building a sort of machine learning approach to just predict AGI so that we can then benchmark. So having all of the tools with which we can then correct for these sampling changes that happen. And, the channel question you raised, Martin, is also really, relevant here in terms of the usage of cash and checks and the demographic differences, certainly by age, by income, by race. Do you
know the race of people or not?
So we are actually working on a big new project right now. The short answer is sort of no. We obviously we know we can use census to know about racial composition of geographic units. What we're keen to do is have self-reported data, which we have through HMDA. For mortgage applications, we are required to collect that information. So for a big mortgage sample, roughly 10 million people that we're assembling, we can have self-reported race information on that. Now, of course, people who apply for a mortgage are very different than people who don't apply for a mortgage. So one additional data asset that we're building is we're bringing in voter registration data from 3 states, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana. Those are 3 states in the Southeast where the voter writing required that they collect race information when they register. And those are 3 states that overlap with our physical branch footprint, so we have big sample sizes there. So we've brought that data in behind the privacy curtain from where we sit on this side, where everything is de-identified. But of course, the data administrators have been doing the match on last name and first name and age or birth date and address, and then so we'll bring that in also as another data sort of subsample where now those folks, they are registered to vote, so they're non-felons, they're citizens, et cetera. So they're also biased, but they're biased in different ways than the mortgage applicant. So with those 2 pieces, we do hope to have actually what is a very big sample size with self-reported race, with which we can then start to look at financial.
And I assume you're not well represented in the bottom quintile of the population or the bottom decile.
In general,
Yeah.
I would say, I can talk about the race, but in general, I would say we feel most confident about the representation of middle-income families and our ability to say something about middle-income families. The reasons are, at the low end, yes, of course, we miss the 6 or 7% of households who are unbanked, and the underbanked will cycle in and out of us just like any other financial institution. Also, low-income families use cash a lot, use money orders a lot, and so our lens on their spending or even on their income is biased by that channel, those channel differences. At the high end, administratively, our data set does not include so-called private bank, the super fancy person bank. So the top, whatever 1% is not there.
So you can't see the money going to the soccer coach to get your kid into Harvard?
Correct. We didn't see that. We don't see that transaction. I wouldn't be able to identify it if I saw it. But
hopefully, if you could, there weren't so many that it would be difficult to identify them.
But also, at the very high end, you worry about people just having quite complicated financial lives and distributing their activities across multiple financial institutions. And so does this checking account, is it comprehensive and really capturing everything that's going on? Maybe, maybe not. So that's why the middle income.
Great. So Crystal, tell us a little bit about what you've actually done at the BLS and the Consumer Price Index program to take advantage of alternative data, and what works well and what are the issues that are not so easy to work with?
Okay, so let me just say David Friedman and Brendan Williams wrote the paper with me, and we tried to survey everything that's going on in the CPI in terms of research and what's moving into production and what we're looking for in terms of alternative data, as well as all of the challenges that we've been facing. And so going almost last, you've heard all the reasons why we shouldn't put it into production, because we face all of the same things that you've heard over and over again. And I can explain those. But I'll give you an example. So first let me tell you, there's 3 different types of data that we are trying to put into the Consumer Price Index. One of it is corporate. That's corporately reported data that comes in a data set, and it's oftentimes sales and quantities at the individual unique item product level, which is fabulous for price index calculation.
Because often you don't have price and quantity from the same source.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So, and long term, we're planning on using the quantities. Right now, we're doing a lot with price replacement, less so except for sampling with the weights, because this is new methodology that we've not done before. So we have measurement objectives in the CPI that we're trying to stay in line with. At the same time, more long term, we're trying to figure out different measurement objectives that can actually harness the power of the data that we're getting. So we've got corporate data. We do web scraping and API usage. We get agreement from the company. We have to, at BLS, to be able to use that data. It's not simply plug and play, which a lot of people think, well, we should just go grab it. It's publicly available. And that's not what we do as an agency. And then there's also secondary source data, which you purchase, sometimes get free, and a lot of talk has been going on about that, where you've got a data aggregator that gathers up the data, and it's from multiple establishments. So, go on. Should I can
give us the most specific example you have, whether it's the Gas Buddy or the hospitals or the new vehicles, something where people get a sense of what you're doing that's different from just the usual survey method.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a corporation that gives us corporate data that we call CorpX. Mm-hmm. We're very strict on confidentiality, so that's as much as you're going to get out of me about that.
Well, it's a department store. You said that in the paper.
It is a department store in the paper. And read more if you want to try to figure it. Okay, so they do give us sales revenue and quantity information for every item that they sell in the store, for all of the stores in the areas that we cover in the CPI, because we have a geographic sample. So there's a lot of issues with data. Some data does not have very much descriptive information, which makes our methodology of match model and item replacement very difficult.
Match model means you're trying to say, how did the price of this same thing change from one period to the next, right?
Yes, and then if that same product goes away, how do we get the most comparable item replacement that we can get?
Right. Or
quality adjust. And so a lot of times we don't have that descriptive data. We also, we were getting data, and then after several years, we were not using it in production. And CorpX we're using in production in the March indexes on February 10th. So it's a major achievement for us. Mm-hmm. But we were getting data, and then they changed their database structure, and they brought each store online at a different time, and it totally ruined any continuity and analysis of a history of data and the index calculation. So we had to start all over. So and every single data source you look at, you've really got to look at years of data, depending on the item, depending on the source, to make sure that it's making sense. So for CorpX, we calculated index. There's a very nice picture in the paper of graphs. We were collecting CorpX online up until this month, and then we're going to use the corporate data this month that we used. We replaced the online prices with our corporate, with our new methodology, and recalculated the index, and it follows very similarly. So we trust that it's okay.
And is this lowering the cost of collecting data, improving the quality or coverage of the data, or both, or neither?
Both, ideally. We've got to be cost effective. As a government agency, we almost always have to make sure that the data's, that whatever we're using is as cheap or cheaper than what we've got. This theoretically reduces the cost of collection because you don't have field staff in the stores reporting the information. But it brings the cost back to Washington office, where we have to do we have to figure out what we've got. We've got to analyze the data. We've got to see if they've done any more changes to it, try to get descriptive information, try to map it to our item structure. So
and do you have a long-term agreement with them? So if they get a new general counsel next month, do you have to start all over again?
We do not. I mean,
okay. Sorry, didn't mean to cause problems.
At any point in time, somebody can say, we're voluntary. I mean, that's part of our gig, right? We're voluntary. Anybody can say no at any time. And so at any time, no matter what kind of data we're getting, they can say no.
Okay. Erica, I know you could talk at length about what Crystal did, but I want you to save that and talk a little bit about what I know you've been very eloquent about the barriers to using data that the government already has within the government.
Right. Okay. Well, so I'm going to start by just reiterating something everybody here knows, that the whole idea of a statistical agency is to provide data for the public good. That's to help businesses, policy makers, and families make really important decisions. They also need to maintain the trust of respondents and users. So that's, you can't do something to solve one problem that will destroy trust in the agency, because that subverts the mission. And this means transparency and confidentiality are very important. You can't do things that are not transparent, and you can't do things that would violate confidentiality. And then, as Crystal said, you need to be sure that you're getting the very most from every data dollar, because those are very constrained. And this is often balancing production versus innovation. Right? So why would you resort to or push the envelope on using some of these new sources? Well, you want to reduce respondent burden. You want to improve statistics in any number of ways: detail, coverage, timeliness, precision, right? And you also want to raise efficiency and resilience, right? And sometimes the fear in adopting one of these sources would be that you would actually lower efficiency because it's so hard to keep it clean, or you would lose resilience because you might lose you build an entire system around a data source that could disappear. So those things are true with external sources. They're also very true with internal sources, government sources as well. So let me talk about three categories that are particularly salient, of issues, particularly salient when you think about the government taking more advantage of its own internal administrative data. The first thing is actually legal restrictions on it. Right? So there are cases, and there's a very prominent case, use of IRS data, all right, where there are very strong restrictions against its use for statistical purposes. In order to change this, new laws would have to be passed, and Congress has been very reluctant to do that. This is why BLS and the census both maintain separate business registers, so that anybody who uses business information from census and BLS will eventually come to understand that these are drawn from two different universes. right? So it's bad for the users.
Because the IRS can share with census and not with BLS.
That's right. The IRS can share with census. Census has that built into their business register, and the BLS does not get the advantage of that information, right? And that means that people who combine the data face a barrier. It also means that you have redundancy, you have duplicative activities. Another example is that even though the federal government pays for the unemployment insurance system across the states own the administrative data for that. And so the BLS does not have access in particular to wage records from the unemployment insurance system, which is everybody's wage records, not just UI recipients, but everyone's wage records. And this means that the BLS has to collect more information than it would have otherwise, has much less detail than it would, and much less timeliness. Okay, so there are the legal restrictions. There are also restrictions that arise from interpretation of law that you might think could be interpreted other ways, but some combination of risk aversion on the part of the attorneys and the agencies interfere with this. And this can be about informed consent. So give you one example. When the census and the BLS both started web scraping information, the BLS, the Department of Labor attorneys interpreted informed consent laws as BLS cannot scrape information without informing the company that's posted that information that they were taking this information down. So there has to be informed consent for web scraped information. The Department of Commerce attorneys either were not consulted, I'm still not sure, or if they were consulted, they said, no, that's fine, it's public, go ahead and use it, right? So at least the interpretation is different. And then when you start to trade information around different parts of the government, where the responsibility lies for maintaining confidentiality can also be problematic to resolve. So these data sharing restrictions are a problem. Another problem, of course, is resources. And it's two elements to this. One is, of course, that the operational arms may be under-resourced, and the statistical agencies surely are. Right. So that's one element, just under-resourcing in general. The second part is who is going to pay for the curation, the storage, the programming, the staff training necessary to convert this operational data into something that's fit for statistical purposes. Is it the producer of the data? Is it the statistical agency? How do you work that out? Someone's got to pay for it, right? And so we heard some examples of where this is happening in the private sector. In the public sector, this happens as well. The third category of barriers, now all of these are manageable, I really believe that, but they are barriers, is when you get inconsistent priorities and missions. Nobody has to be evil to have different missions, right? If you're an operational agency, do you slow down your processes or prioritize giving the statistical agency the information they want over getting your operations in train? Probably not, right? And then the statistical agency has to figure out how it's going to operate in a world where it may not be able to get the information that it is expecting in order to get its releases out on time. So that could affect timeliness, it could affect continuity. We heard about that when programming changes happen. Quality could affect enhancements that the statistical agency would like to add to those data that the operational agency doesn't care about. All right. It could certainly affect documentation as well. It could also affect whether or not the statistical agencies even know about the data, because the operational agencies don't have any particular incentive to reveal the existence of potentially useful information because that's not their mission. Right. And then finally, there is the very human element that no data are perfect, and yet it's embarrassing to agencies to reveal that they have imperfect data, right? And so there's an understandable reluctance to have somebody else come in and muck around with your data and point out all of its flaws. When you have your own workarounds that have saved you money or have saved you grief during that time.
You say operational agencies. Do you mean like the FAA or what?
Yeah, I think, for example, the unemployment insurance part of the Department of Labor, right? They are running unemployment insurance programs across the country, all right? But EEOC is another example. All of these agencies, I'm thinking of it from the point of view of BLS, but they have a programmatic mission, and they collect data. They use it for those reasons. Now, many of these barriers can be managed, they can be lifted, and some of this is underway. The Ryan Murray Commission on Evidence-Based Policy Making that Ron Haskins from Brookings was involved with, and Catherine Abraham, has made recommendations to cut down on some of these barriers, and that led to some recently passed legislation to improve many of these things that we're talking about, including creating a departmental data officer in every agency that is responsible for making sure best practices for maintenance of data are followed and that data is not hidden under a bushel. It also moves us closer to the presumption that government data, that the default for government data will be shared unless there's a compelling reason otherwise, right? So we get closer to that point. And it requires this registration of federally maintained data sets, and there are a number of other steps in the right direction, which will make a difference. But more needs to be done. We still haven't cracked the nut of state ownership of the UI wage records. That's not addressed. We haven't cracked the nut of of IRS information, right? Restrictions. And funding, of course, is a huge issue. That's not addressed at all. If anything, it's getting worse. I will say, though, that this administration has proposed moving the Bureau of Labor Statistics to the Commerce Department for a number of issues that I've just mentioned. That could be very helpful because there's reason to think that restrictions on BLS access to IRS data may be lifted if BLS were within the Commerce Department instead of within the Department of Labor. And so that would be good. So it would increase access to data. It would also reduce...
I assume you're speaking for yourself and not the BLS staff when you advocate that.
Well, I've talked to a lot of BLS staff, and there are reasons why people worry about it. And I think, I think those worries are legitimate, but I think they can be addressed. And
Do you think it would be a good thing to move it?
I think it could be done badly, but done properly, it would be an extremely good thing, right?
That was a very good answer.
Anyway, and that would take us one step closer to what I think would be the ideal solution of an independent Stats USA, not in the Commerce Department, outside of the cabinet, basically.
I think we should. I have a lot of questions, but I want to give you all a chance. If not, I'll keep going. Does anybody? Oh, yeah, sir. Howen is running over.
Hi, Chris McRae. So I think only one person today has actually mentioned machine intelligence or AI. Is that simply because there are so many barriers in the kinds of data sets we've been talking about that basically a machine wouldn't be able to work out all the different legal hurdles and other things that are in the middle of this?
So I didn't get to it. I mean, we were mostly talking about data sources rather than AI, but certainly at BLS, and I know at Census, there is an increasing use of AI. For right now, all of the agencies have a fair number of human coders who look at responses and convert text to those codes, and AI has been extremely useful for occupation codes, for parts of the body's injured codes, things like that. And so there's very much an increase in use of AI for coding in particular. also for modeling. That's the other place where it's being used. So yes, there's more than you think, but less than there could be.
Yeah, I did mention one quick application of machine learning in our context, which was, we don't observe annual gross income for everybody, but we do actually observe it for some people. People who apply for a mortgage, we ask, what is your annual gross income? Even people who, and we have to verify that. For people who, have a credit card with us, similar, we ask them for their stated income. So with those truth sets, we have leveraged that through an ML approach to try and predict the annual gross income for everybody else in our checking account universe so that we can then reweight the population to reflect the census. So that was one application of it, yeah.
And just real quick, we use machine learning to match the item descriptions to the CPI item structure. Currently, we're also looking at ways to do some kind of data analysis to try to flag problems in the data without our analysts doing it by hand.
Antoine?
Erica, could I ask you, because you're probably in a better position than anyone to talk about this.
In the center, anyway.
You've talked about some movement that there has been in terms of legislation, which is good. Some movement in terms of the use of big data and AI, that's good. If you, now that you're no longer at the Bureau, would have to make a guess, and I realize it would not be more than a professional guess, as to how much time it will take before, let's say, the Bureau uses big data, artificial intelligence in a, what I would call, significant way to replace or add to some of the sampling techniques that are being used now. What would that be in terms of a time frame?
Mm-hmm. So let me answer what I can. I think you can expect that in general, the statistical agencies will in their operations, always lag behind the private sector, because the decisions made on those data are so important that for a private data product or an experimental product on the part of the agencies, you can experiment all you want, but when you're talking about the CPI that drives, where a tenth of a percentage point mistake means the federal government over or underspends $1 billion on Social Security benefits, you're going to be very careful, right? So that means you need a lot of testing beforehand. That means lags, right? And I think that's what you want from a statistical agency, right? So it will. Now, I think some things will actually be developed in statistical agencies before they get someplace else. A lot of, for instance, seasonal adjustment has really been a statistical agency expertise that the private sector didn't even have for many years. Right? So there are many things that happen before there. Then the question is, well, how quickly can things that now seem to be quite dependable externally be really embedded in the statistical agencies? Knowing the BLS as I do, I think the biggest barrier there is funding. That in order to make these innovations, you have to run them in parallel for a long time to the current production process before you bring them into production. And that means you have to have the staff, the skills, and the IT capacity to do this in many different ways, in many different programs, at the same time that you are still producing the monthly and quarterly numbers at the same quality that were being produced before. And right now, BLS has had flat nominal funding for a decade. It's very difficult to be rethinking all of your programs when the real value of your budget has been declining for so long.
Crystal, in your paper, you talk a lot about data that you purchased, right? So I assume there's a budget constraint there, of course. I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I was interested, if you're comfortable, about what you did with physician services in hospitals, where you have problems. The paper says there's a very bad response rate,
Right.
And you did something clever there, and what we've learned from that.
Right. So, so for physicians and hospital services, we've.
No, she was already on, Erica.
Oh, I was sorry. I'm on. It's a it's a 4% relative importance in terms of the CPI, and the response rate for medical care is the worst in the CPI for a number of reasons, because of confidentiality concerns for medical, and we can go on about that, but the response rate is 48%. So, and it's a very large sample size, it's very difficult to collect, it's very costly to send our field staff, and we keep getting lack of response. So for a variety of reasons, we were concerned about that. We had, how do you say it? We had issues with our medical care accuracy. Is that too bad?
That's pretty good.
Okay.
We got it.
So we really wanted to try to figure out a solution for medical care. So we bought a data set that probably 4 years ago with our research staff, and that was very lagged data for medical claims. So it's insurance, but they've got a lot of information about physicians and hospitals and what the costs are from that. So it's like a separate use of alternative data. So we got like what we were considering a truth data set. Then we got another data set where we just researched. It was just Chicago. It was just 2 years of data. It was just a selection, one little sample for physicians and hospitals to try to see if it was feasible to use this for these indexes. And the results were very promising. So just this year, we bought more data. We bought it across the country. We bought a bigger sample. So we're hopeful that the research at the end of this year, so far it looks good, and we're hopeful that this will be a supplement. It's insurance only, but it'll be a supplement to what we produce for the sample for physicians and hospital services. So that's supplementing our sample and making the accuracy of the index hopefully much better.
Fiona, could you talk a little bit about how you have integrated academics, PhD students into the JPMorgan Chase project?
Yeah, we've done this, really since the beginning. We have collaborated with a few academics, and I emphasize few because we are often asked by academics to access our data. And I mean, the arrangement that we've built has been first starting with some PhD students, but now, a few of them have moved on, and we've brought in a few other folks, junior and senior faculty, to either have access to the data and write an academic paper on the data, or to be a collaborator with somebody else who does have access. I would say we've waxed and waned in terms of how much we want to expand this program, or how much we feel we can expand it, just because the academic publishing timeline is 3 years, right? So the unit costs on a single academic paper from our standpoint are very high. I mean, all of the work that Claudia described in terms of just understanding a data set, and leveraging it for economic research, for each and every academic to get up that learning curve, and then produce a white paper, take it on the circuit, get it through the publishing process. I mean, it's a big investment. So it is not a program that we have felt that we can scale for that reason. And
are there compliance issues?
We've worked through compliance. No, it's not hugely. I mean, there are aspects of our data that we don't allow these academic fellows to access. But you know, I think one thing that is, in addition just to the sort of, we don't want to give unfettered data access for 3 years to a single person to write one paper. I mean, that's a sort of just a value proposition that doesn't quite work for us in terms of cost versus benefit. But then underlying, you know, what's going on within the bank, it is the private sector. Things change so fast, right? Whether it's our privacy controls or our governance structure or our tech stack. I mean, our tech stack is completely, you know, changing over right now. And so the code base that these academics wrote 2 years ago, if they want to revise that paper, guess what? They're going to have to refactor the entire code set into a, you know, a different, in different language, in a different processing environment. So it's almost like they can't keep up with the rate of change that we experience.
Yeah. Michael, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, so what does Visa think of, you mentioned one instance where you do provide to government, this state and local governments, what's happening to international tourism. What in general is the stance about giving data? You know, let's say the Fed said we'd love to see your data. What are the privacy concerns, the commercial concerns, or just in general, what are the constraints that help people understand why this doesn't happen all the time? Why isn't the Fed just swooping up all the data from every credit card company in the country? And
Sure. Well, a lot of it, I mean, one is just technical in reason, right? So, you know, I'll give you an example. Our CEO actually just met with representatives of the Federal Reserve here last week. And, you know, we received the request, I believe it was a week and a half before he came to town here, which was not near enough time to clean our data and turn it around to make it representative of, you know, the larger economy. So, a lot of these technical challenges that Claudia mentioned are probably number one from the economist perspective. From the lawyers and shareholders perspective, it really is about data privacy concerns in an environment in which those rules and regulations are changing literally daily, some part across the world. You know, Visa is a truly global company, so what privacy rules and regs are implemented globally matter for our at least IT infrastructure and ecosystem here in the U.S. as well. So those barriers are erected internally. And then finally, as I alluded to earlier, it's really about how do we as a public company share payment volume data, which is then very representative of what our earnings flow would look like for a specific quarter. From a statistical user standpoint, I want as much real-time data to do analysis on the government shutdown and hurricane effects and so on and so forth. And even myself sitting within Visa, it's extremely restrictive to publish anything or opine on anything or comment on anything until after an earnings release.
Right. So I have a Visa card. Have I given you permission to use my data for all this stuff, or is that how it works?
So the agreement is not only with the cardholder, but also with the merchant. Both of those handshakes have to occur for us to have visibility into the data. And then, as some of you may know, beginning in next year in California, you will have the right to opt out of that, us having visibility to that data as well as part of those new provisions. That's an example at the state level. And we see a number of other states also moving in the direction of greater privacy, which then gets to the more fundamental question about big data is it truly representative? And that representation of the data is going to dramatically change over time as tastes and preferences about individual privacy use evolve.
Interesting. Okay, with that, please join me in thanking the panel for a fascinating discussion. We ended on just the right note. Brian Harris Cote is going to talk about privacy. Brian is the director of the Committee on National Statistics at the National Academies of Science. And importantly, for this purpose, I learned that he majored both in psychology and religious studies in college. So we're going to get both the left and right brain thing. He also has a PhD in social psychology, and he knows a lot about this stuff. So Brian's going to talk some, and then we'll do some questions on that. And thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me okay? So it's always dangerous to be asked to talk about privacy, especially at the end of an exciting set of presentations and discussion. I had planned to use slides, but I thought I probably needed one, just something that says, sorry, no. We, in fact, have at the National Academies are, doing a lot of different studies at the Committee on National Statistics and other places that involve privacy, and we've tried to recruit privacy experts and to be on different panels, and I can tell you, I've been told, I don't want to be the person who has to tell everybody no. So the advantage to being last is that I think all of the really good points have already been made by people who can express them more eloquently than I can. Let me just kind of recap a little bit here. So it's clear that there are really exciting possibilities with using big data, with using multiple data sources. This is something that is every National Statistical Office in the world is interested in right now. I can tell you I've been to 3 or 4 international conferences in the past year, and this is the topic of how do every country is trying to figure out how can they better utilize administrative data, private sector data, sensor data, other kinds of digital exhaust, organic data, whatever you want to call it, and harness this information and figure out how to, as you can see, deal with all of the challenges, clean it, filter it, weight it, and use it, and most often to figure out how to either supplement official statistics or enhance existing federal statistics. The replace word, the substitute, as you heard from several people here today, is like nowhere near that. Realistically, but sometimes we can produce much more detailed, much more timely data, other data on other topics that we currently can't measure well at all or that we're not measuring. So there's a lot of potential here, but there are a lot of costs. There's a lot of research and a lot of work that has to go into doing this. And as Erica pointed out, which I think we're all very well aware, it's also something that agencies feel is really necessary to do, although they're not being given the resources to do it, but the costs of their data collections, their budgets have been flat or declining in real terms, and yet pressures for more data from users are rising, but their data collection costs are going up. Respondents are less likely to want to respond to voluntary or even mandatory surveys that are going on. And so, and some of their concerns of respondents are tied to privacy and confidentiality. We can't tell you exactly what percentage of that is. It certainly doesn't help that they're hearing on the news that the Census Bureau is collecting citizenship data. These are long-term trends. We've been seeing this happening for many years, for decades, but it seems to be accelerating in recent years. I haven't seen real recent data. I don't know if it's been accelerating in recent months or not. And I think we all recognize that there are real fundamental societal concerns here and issues involving privacy that arise regularly in the news and in national conversations that implicitly and explicitly are about privacy. How often is it between announcements in the news about different data breaches or some other kind of thing like a data broker or data aggregator, which we knew about, but lots of people in the public didn't know about. It's like, wait a minute. There are people out there who do nothing but vacuum up data, or Experian now, has all of this information on me, and now it's gone. And then there's the bug that's a feature, the hidden microphone in your thermostat, and other sources of surveillance, technology, cameras, sensors, cell phones. There are. Add to this the obtuse privacy policies that someone referred to just a little while ago, and the terms of service that, for every app that you're doing, that you want to utilize something that's I don't read on a tiny screen. You accept because you want to use this nice, cool, wonderful gadget, and you just gave them permission to collect all kinds of information on you. So this larger context here is certainly coloring the perception of the public as well as some of us, but colors perceptions of the things that we're trying to do for the public good. And there's not a lot we can do about that. So company X sharing data with the government, you know, there are all, as you've heard firsthand and with better than I can express, perceptions and concerns about that and different arrangements for that. Likewise, the government, you know, if it was revealed that the government was sharing data with company X, wait a minute, what's going on here? And who owns stock in this company? And so all of this is being very much viewed in an atmosphere of mistrust and in the context of all these breaches and other things going on. And I'm sorry to say that if we walk in and say, trust us, we're researchers, we're only doing good things, that's probably not going to help a lot, unfortunately. What you've seen a little bit here, and I'm sure there's a lot more examples in the conference to come, but are different arrangements for data being shared, that how this is being done, and some of it wasn't as explicit, but you know, this is happening under a variety of different circumstances. So sometimes it's microdata, but often it's not. It's often more aggregated data that is actually being shared. So BLS is, and Census and other agencies are trying to get more companies to say, give us lots of data, and you have long-standing relationships with many establishments and are trying to, you know, continue to cultivate those relationships. But it's a relationship with each company that you're doing that with. But there are also other arrangements. So was mentioned Palantir is kind of the intermediary here for First Data. And there are other similar kinds of arrangements where you're not getting access to, BEA is not getting access to the microdata and being able to match at an establishment level or anything like that. And so there are different ways of dealing with this. And you can see here that even some of the issues that were especially clear in the last panel, even when parties are interested and motivated, there's a whole raft of complex legal and policy issues that have to be addressed and that take a lot of time to negotiate these things. The BEA just didn't call up First Data and say, hey, or, you know, how about sharing some data with us? Next week, good for you guys. We'll get together and do this. These even BLS and Census, BEA and Census and other agencies sharing what they're able to share, legally able to share. The rule of thumb used to be about 18 months to negotiate some of these memoranda of understanding between agencies for getting access to some of the administrative data that Erica referred to, as well as other kinds of data. So these are kinds of things even when folks want to do them and believe they're doing them for the right reasons and for the right purposes, take a lot of time. If you start talking about the private sector, the company has to address some of the issues that you heard raised here. Liability in case the data are illegitimately accessed. What is the scope of access? Are they complying with privacy laws? Are they complying with security and exchange laws, which I hadn't thought of before, so thanks for sharing that. What are the impact of freedom of information laws? Is sharing violating terms of service? And then there's simply a perception of, well, you know, the company is hanging on to their data and they're protecting it really, they believe really well. Why would we let it out? Can the government protect it as well as we do? What happens if somebody else has access to it and they breach it? What are our responsibilities? What are our liabilities? And what are the perception issues then? There's a fair amount of talk about trying to do these agency, kind of the public-private partnerships, and those can be in these kinds of situations. And I think it's worth pointing out that sometimes our federal agencies aren't the greatest partners in the world. We are very proud of our confidentiality laws, and especially Title 13 and SIPC, but they also really put a limit on what the agencies can do. So we think it's great that, yes, we can take the data into the agency and don't worry, it can't come out. well, that's kind of a lousy deal for a partner. So what's the partnership here? So I give you my data, you get to use it, and what do I get in return? And so in terms of figuring out kind of how better we can work, the agencies could work with private sector firms to make this a win-win situation. So it isn't just well, we buy the data from you, so figuring out how to make this work in an atmosphere and under a situation that respects the confidentiality and protects the data of both the private sector firm and obviously the statistical agency. I can share a few observations of what we've seen by doing a few studies at the National Academies. I just want to point you to a panel that many of you may have heard of. We had a panel chaired by Bob Groves looking at multiple data sources for federal statistics. Shameless self-promotion. That panel produced 2 reports. You can get these off the National Academy's website, National Academy's Press, nap.edu. You can download them for free. Just look up federal statistics. This panel was specifically charged with looking at how to utilize multiple new data sources to enhance federal statistics. Out of the 2 volumes, 3 chapters are on privacy, more than any other topic, recognizing that this is a fundamental issue that has to be addressed. It's not only an issue with the survey data that agencies produce and disseminate now, but it becomes even more of a critical issue as you try and bring in, whether it's administrative data sources or private sector or other kinds of data sources. Similarly, the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking has been mentioned several times. Privacy was fundamental to kind of what they talked about as well. They had privacy experts on that panel, on the Commission, I should say, and that figured prominently in their solution. Both the Commission and our panel recommended going in the direction of some kind of intermediary, some kind of trusted third party. Many of you know the Commission referred to it as a National Secure Data Service, not a big, huge data warehouse that would have a nice big target painted on it, but a service that brought together and linked these data and provided access and then let them disappear, which researchers go, you let the data go away? But they figured that was the only way that they could get buy-in for something like that. Our panel similarly talked about, they did not make anywhere near as specific a recommendation, but talked about the various models that there might be for doing this, and gave some different examples and talked about the strengths and weaknesses of each one in terms of the different locations, whether it should be an agency or it should be a federally funded research data center or it should be some kind of university partnership or something like that, where it would be, what kinds of functions it would serve, and those kinds of issues. Trying to address kind of the 2 major types of privacy risk, which have been talked about a little bit here indirectly, but one is kind of the obvious one is the security breach, but the other is the inferential breach, is the ability to, even when, as many of you know, even when you're just putting out aggregate level statistics, if you put out enough aggregate statistics, too many of them too accurately, the fundamental law of information recovery says from cryptography and computer science shows that you can reconstruct a data set. And Census Bureau has done some cutting edge research in this regard and has recently talked about actually you can re-identify some of these people. Census was able to re-identify some of these people because they knew the truth. Other people could reconstruct a data set but wouldn't be able to know if the record that they had reconstructed or not, what was an actual person and who that person was. So these kinds of issues are what we're dealing with. The more proliferation of these kinds of data there are out there, the more risks and threats there are to the business that we're trying to do in producing information for the public good. And so the panel talked about, kind of really recognized, we're right now in a period of transition. We have all of these data sources out there, and we're aware of the weaknesses of our current methods for kind of protecting them, at least from an inferential basis. And it's rather obvious that there are weaknesses in protecting security of data sets more generally. But the feasibility of actually implementing some of these technologies, such as differential privacy, hasn't been clearly demonstrated yet. We need more case studies. We need more research and development to show how this can be done and what the costs and benefits of implementation of these methods are. We're going to need a lot more work across collaborators and stakeholders to move forward to provide good privacy protection while getting access to more data sets. And we need robust discussions of the implications of this for all stakeholders and for users. What does this mean for users? I think these discussions really need to be informed by some concrete examples that will help people understand what the implications are of these technologies. And in my final act of shameless self-promotion, we're putting on a workshop on this June 6th and 7th at the National Academies on challenges and approaches for protecting privacy in federal statistical programs, trying to highlight some of these issues, looking at statistical disclosure limitation methods, looking at differential privacy, talking about the policy issues, talking about the implications for data users, and what agencies are struggling with right now. And so if you're interested, that will be on our Committee on National Statistics website. We'll have a flyer posted in about a week. We really hope to kind of help have a dialogue here with the broader statistical and economic community to deal with these privacy issues. They're pervasive, they're not going away, and they fundamentally affect what we're all trying to do. So thanks.
Thanks. Let me ask you, I want to ask you a couple questions, and I want to offer the audience a chance to ask questions of anybody, any of the speakers who are still here. We can be open. First of all, what is differential privacy?
Good question. Is Danny still here?
He's in the back.
Danny, you want to answer that? He's told me he's writing a paper on this. Differential privacy is an approach. It's a property, actually, of an algorithm that infuses noise in statistical results, so making it more difficult to be able to reconstruct the underlying data. And this is something that is been used in cryptography, comes out of cryptography and computer science. There's a lot of theoretical development on it. It's relatively very recent, being applied to federal statistical agencies, but a number of agencies around the world are looking at this. The UK has been looking into it. The Census Bureau has been looking into it. John Abott has been leading an effort there, trying to deal with the shortfalls in our current methods of statistical disclosure limitation methods, things that you're all familiar with, doing some kinds of perturbation, doing data swapping, doing top coding. All of those things are used to work in the world a couple decades ago. They're not sufficient anymore. With
so basically the question is, what we're worried about is if the Census Bureau says in this census tract there are 3 black people, it's pretty easy to figure out which one is male and which one is female, and with all sorts of other things, you can pretty much get to figure out who they are. And so then there's no privacy there. And the old system is you pretend that there's only 2 black people there and put one of them somewhere else or something. And this is a cryptographic way to accomplish the same goal, but not to distort the data so much. Or have I done violence to this?
So under the old system, they tell you that they swapped some percentage of records, and of course the exact percentage that they swap is
swap from one census tract to another.
Yes. And so that even if you find that, it's like, aha, I found this record and I bet this is you. And, you know, your age and race and in your household. But there's uncertainty with that. It's like, well, it could be you, but it could also be somebody in the next county.
I see.
This
is an alternative to that.
Yes.
Okay, and so I'm going to step back for a minute and ask kind of a big picture question. So there's one view that it's just a matter of time before we figure out how to take advantage of all this big data and the machine learning and AI techniques we have, and the speed with which we can collect it. And we'll just have an increasingly ever clearer picture of what's going on in the world. We'll have a much richer sense of academics will have a better sense of what's really going on, and the cost of gathering data will be less, and the statistical agencies will be able to tell the Federal Reserve to the minute how the economy is doing. So that's kind of like one caricature. And the other is, you referred to this, and so did some of the panelists are, this is about, we're at about the limit, because the angst about A, the security of the data, the hacking, and B, the people wanting to protect their privacy, the Europeans, the Californians, means that like the more attention this gets, the more there's going to be a reaction, and that the first case scenario is just going to basically forever be a raisin that dries in the sun, because the public response, this urge for privacy, this reaction against Big Brother, the everybody jokes that if I forget my password, I'll just call the Chinese and they'll give it to me. That politically that's gathering steam. And I wondered, first of all, what do you think of my characterization, and do you agree that somehow the privacy, fear of hacking thing is growing and is going to constrain us from the ideal?
I'm not sure the ideal is
right.
ideal as
the
you
extreme.
paint it.
The extreme.
But I think there are legitimate concerns about privacy, and I think we, as the commission talked about, as well as our panel, the idea of a national data center came up in the 1960s, and it blew up and ended up inspiring the Privacy Act. And so I think folks are trying to be very, very careful this time and figure out how we can do this right and how we can really build in these protections so that we can do some very important work and get valuable insights. So I think it's critical that we do it right. Which way it's going to go, I have no idea.
Right. I guess there are two competing issues. One is lack of trust in institutions in general and lack of trust in experts. That's one thing. On the other hand, people seem to be willing to give up an extraordinary amount of data about themselves to Facebook or Amazon or Netflix. And so it's not clear to me that they say they're worried about privacy, but they don't act on those concerns.
Yeah, and there's somebody who can probably answer that better than I can. But it doesn't mean that... So part of the issue here is that no person can... They're not reading those terms of service. They're right. Sacrificing something for an immediate, for the coolest, latest thing. But then they're absolutely appalled when they find out that Facebook has done this, or this app has been collecting this information, or there's a microphone in my thermostat that I didn't know about. And so we've reached a point where nobody can possibly understand these terms of service. No reasonable company can tell them exactly how their data are going to be used under all circumstances, or how they're sharing it with others folks. So some people say that we kind of need a whole different conversation here, and Europe has obviously gone one direction here about what does privacy mean, what kind of society do we want to live in, and how do we deal with this? And I have no idea where that's going to
go. Sir, can you bring the mic down here? And I want to emphasize, you can happen to pepper Brian with questions, but if any of the other speakers are here and either want to weigh in on this privacy thing or if you want to ask a question, please go ahead.
My name is Mark Brodsky. I think all this is hopeless in privacy. You haven't got to the real identifier, which is DNA-related information. And once that gets up there, and you then could track who put up the DNA and where and relate it to everything else. Why haven't I heard DNA mentioned in this whole discussion today?
Well, I think the short answer is that so far, very few people are using DNA to improve the measurement of the economy. So I emphasize so far, although I think you illustrate, but you illustrate exactly the thing I noticed. So you read these incredible stories about people who voluntarily had their DNA tested, made it available to other people who have similar DNA, and all of a sudden you discover your father isn't your father. And I think also the issue comes up quite a bit in health insurance. If once they start knowing everything about your genome, it's going to destroy the very concept of insurance. But I think the short answer is the one I gave before. A gentleman in the back? Oh, Jack.
Excuse me. Question for Brian, and then a quick mention of a conference coming up that is going to have many panels like the great one we saw today. Differential privacy. John Abeld and Steve Ruggles from University of Minnesota are having like a traveling debate society where they debate each other regarding. So John is the chief scientist at Census, and he's really the advocate and really the evangelist for differential privacy, and maintains that differential privacy will not really harm the ability of economists to do research, that the underlying statistics will still be accessible, and Steve Ruggles takes exception to that. So really a question for you is, has CNSTAT, or do you have an opinion, does CNSTAT have an opinion about the potential negative implications of differential privacy for economic research? And then just very quick, National Association for Business Economics, NABE, next November 3rd through 5th in Seattle, is having a conference in which Erica, Crystal were at the last one, John Stevens, talking about this kind of thing, big data held by the private sector, and the role of the government in getting access to them in a way that is useful for economic statistics.
So no way am I getting between John and Steve. Very dangerous place. So I think part of the issue here is we don't have concrete examples of what this really looks like in practice, and we don't know what it would mean. I mean, the users are scared to death that their microdata are going to be taken away, and there'll be no more agency microdata ever again. And so that's driving some fears, and we don't know what the or at least I certainly don't know, what does it mean to have epsilon of 1 or 2 or 10? And so I think what I believe is needed, or is a first step, is much more dialogue and back and forth, rather than this is the way we have to go, and by God, please you're no way are you going there, which is a little bit of what's happening now. That's a gross oversimplification, but I'm.
A gentleman here in the sweater.
Thank you. George Sadowski, ex-Brookings. You mentioned Europe, and recently the European Union has stepped up enforcement with penalties of its GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations. To what extent are they going to be the leader in this privacy? To what extent are they going to set, by restriction, the policy for data sharing of private firms?
Anybody want to answer that? So the U.S. has obviously had a very different system that's much more sectoral so healthcare data are covered under HIPAA, education data under FERPA, some data are Privacy Act. So we've taken a very divided approach here, and they've taken a much more unified approach. The more globalization is occurring, they're impacting some of the big technology companies like Google and Apple and forcing changes in what they do. To the extent that then spills over here, that I think they could end up having a large impact.
George, you want to add something?
Visa must have European.
Yeah, I was going to ask Michael.
Visa must have European.
You anticipated my. And George, you're the first person I ever met who was ex-Brookings. I thought it was like the Marines. You were never ex.
All right, so hard to follow that. So essentially, there's a few things that Visa's doing, obviously, a number of things that we've had to do to conform to GDPR regulations in Europe. The sort of nuance with our firm in particular is that Visa Europe for the longest time was really operated as a separate business. And it was only in recent times has that been folded into our universe. And that's why we're starting to see it sort of transform the data flow that we have internally. So from our perspective, we are seeing a migration of the IT systems into a unified system. And as part of that, obviously, we need to build in the same barriers, backstops, and protections that we have in Europe to ensure that both the U.S. and Europe data are not mixing, but also that those provisions for data that is allowed to mix are separate and comply with GDPR regulations.
And this is before China lets you in, huh? Right?
Correct.
The gentleman in the back in the red sweatshirt.
Mike Zone, you've a word that has not been mentioned is X12 EDI from ANSI. It has a pretty mature standard for HIPAA and privacy and a few other things, and as long as it can be prevented from being aggravated, and it's aggregated from disaggregated, so you can find so that for privacy. They have a continuing effort, and it's also structured so it can interface with big data and AI tools. It doesn't do all of the psychosocial type things, but it certainly would answer the question of what happens when you have a hurricane and what's happening to all the everything. IRS, some of the bigger companies are using it as a reporting standard from companies like John Deere and Granger to report to the IRS. And I just wonder if that's come across your purview.
Does any of the people here have a view? Anything about it? We'll note that. Over here? Did you have a question? Yeah. Stephanie, can you? Or you can use two microphones.
Yeah. Marita Gandelsky, BEA. My question is both as an academic researcher and as a government economist. Do you think there should be different standards of, well, not different standards, but different treatments of differential privacy for statistical agencies versus academic research? Because one of our primary challenges as academic researchers is to correct for biases that we see from things like added noise when we get this sort of data. And as government economists, we spend so much time trying to get our statistics exactly right that, of course, the addition of noise to data scares us. So I was wondering if you think there should be a different sort of treatment for those things.
I have no thoughts about that. I have not heard anyone talk about that before either. One of the advantages that is touted about differential privacy is that it actually gives us better insights into the properties of the data or the impact of disclosure protection on the data than we have right now. Right now, you have no idea what BLS or Census or anyone else has done to the data, how that actually affects the result. With differential privacy, you actually can model and understand the noise that was added to that. So there may be some better insights possible that way.
I think there's also, as I understand it, as an observer here, there's a bit of question about differential access to some researchers get to look at the unnoised data and others only get to look at the noise, and that creates a little bit of tension among the researchers. Danny, do you want to say anything about differential privacy, since I know you live and breathe this?
Well, you twisted my arm.
Didn't take much twisting.
So first of all, the name is unfortunate because it does suggest that some people get a different amount of privacy than other people. And in fact, the techniques don't even have to do so much with privacy per se. They really have to do with trying to answer questions so that you get answers that depend on the distribution and not on the sample. And if you think about it that way, then it's actually what you would want to do even if you were talking about data that comes from rocks and stars rather than from people. So it's also not an algorithm. It's not adding noise to the data. It's adding noise to the answers. And you need to do that because of federal law and because of theorems. Not because somebody said, oh, this is a little bit better than swapping, but because the federal law says that the census, for example, is not allowed to reveal any kind of information that comes from, that can be tied back to an individual, right? And the Census Bureau has shown in its experiments that you can implement some of the theorems that have been proven over the last few years. And from the released tables, the aggregate tables that are routinely put out from the census, you can re-identify individuals. And if you combine it with commercially available data, you can get their names and addresses, and if you pay a few pennies, you can get thousands of fields of information about them. So that's unfortunate if you don't want people to know something about ethnicity and race and other things that aren't readily available in commercial data sets. But now if you imagine that there's a citizenship question, then that's a very, very, very serious matter if you can re-identify from published tables people's citizenship. So that's completely, you have to do something about that. That's theorems and federal law. And the theorem is, well, the definition, differential privacy is a definition. It's a concept. It says that it's virtually impossible to find out anything about an individual by answering questions in a differentially private manner. So a mechanism for answering questions is either differentially private or not. Again, you're not adding noise to the data because in order to do that, you need a model. And once you've assumed a model, you'll never really get anything else out of the data. So you don't add noise to the data, you add noise to the answers. And then you can prove a theorem that says that you can actually protect privacy, and you can't even tell whether a given individual was in the data set or not. And if you can't tell whether I was in the data set or not, then obviously you can't tell anything about me. And so that's the theorem, that's what they're trying to implement at the Census Bureau. And it's hard to know any other concept that would apply given the laws and given the theorems.
Thank you. Antoine, and then Jim.
First of all, thank you for what I thought was a fantastic, if I can, when we're talking about productivity, even exciting forum. You mentioned something as a risk that is perhaps the longer we wait, the more difficult it is to get some of these data, as opposed to the other side. And so I had a thought. I heard Erica talk about the funding, which is obviously a very big problem, although in the big picture, it's of course not a big problem. I mean, in the overall government budget. But you mentioned something that struck me, and you said, you know, an 0.1% difference in the measurement of the CPI is a serious matter because it may cost $1 billion plus. So I had a thought. We know that if we measure the productivity improvement right, inflation will go down. So we will save the government money. So this is a very good investment to save money. Or am I wrong?
Without prejudicing whether we're measuring it too high or too low, that's the goal of our project.
Chris McRae, to have one more go at your caricature question, if we were to look back from the future of 2030, and if it is correct that there are going to be lots more computer brains and everything over this next decade, are there any countries which have a model which is, you know, just worth looking at? I mean, a couple of ideas. Some people say that Liechtenstein's blockchain model is good. I'm not talking about minting coins, but and some people would look at India and say, well, they put Noel Carney in the middle of creating a billion-person identity. Maybe that is the sort of future of census and surveys, at least for India. So I was just wondering if there are any cases that people look at and think, well, at least those are good for those countries, or those are worth looking at.
I mean, I was just going to say, if all you care about is getting information on individuals to a great extent, and you don't have to worry about privacy, the Chinese seem to be pretty good at that. I mean, with all the these social scores they're building and the facial recognition, I'm hoping that they're not. Now we look back in 2030 that the United States has not come into that world, and that 1984 looks like amateur hour. Can you imagine what Orwell would have done if he'd known about AI and facial recognition? But I mean, it's a good point. I think there obviously are things to be learned from other countries, maybe not the ones that the conclusion I just draw from China, but when you look at statistical agencies, the Canadians have done what Erica thinks we should do, have an independent statistical agency. There's a CRAW paper that some work from the Bank of England's done about scraping job help wanted sites to get information. So I think that, and we've learned in other contexts that Americans have a certain arrogance that we must do this stuff better than everybody else, that there's no point in talking to people from other countries, and we're trying to press against that prejudice. Yep.
Just share one anecdote is a lot of national statistical offices around the world, again, in trying to adapt to this new world, the Statistics Netherlands has kind of been on the cutting edge in terms of trying to utilize more new alternative data sources and produce official statistics. Has taken a rather different response in terms of really trying to reorient the whole agency in terms of producing information that is in fact immediately relevant or mining from what they're doing and being more information oriented that way, as opposed to, it's not, they're not producing GDP just like they used to, but trying to be more responsive and to various policy issues, and so it's causing a lot of folks around the world to rethink exactly how to maintain their core principles, but be more responsive and relevant.
Right, it's a good point. I think someone from the Netherlands Statistical Agency is speaking at the CRAW conference tomorrow. I want to thank the CRAW for helping us organize this. Hawen Chen and Anna Dawson and Vivian Lee and I don't know who else, Mike Ng, who helped us on our staff, is Stephanie Sensula. These conferences always seem like no one had to do any work to make it happen, but in my experience, that's not the case. And so this one didn't have any flaws, so that's even better. And I want to thank all the panelists and speakers who came, and of course all of you for being so thoughtful and having such good questions. I have one request. If there's a glass or a piece of paper at your feet, if you could take it to the back of the room or put it outside, I'd appreciate that. And with join, please join me in thanking everybody who participated.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.